Have you ever believed something about a nation, only to wake up one day and realize the world had quietly changed behind your back? Have you ever thought that when young minds flee their homeland, it's always toward America, Europe, or Japan, never toward the islands of the Pacific? For decades, that's what everyone thought. Until one morning in 2025, a small headline in a Manila newspaper asked a question no one expected. Why are Israeli students flooding Philippine universities? At first, it sounded like a typo. Israel, the nation known for its world-class universities, its innovation hubs, its pride in education and resilience, sending students to the Philippines? Impossible, people said. Even some professors in Tel Aviv chuckled when the topic surfaced. One of them, a respected sociologist, dismissed it with a smirk. They're probably just tourists looking for cheap sun. But within weeks, his own students began applying to universities in Manila, Davao, and Cebu. Something profound was happening. Something no one saw coming. It started quietly. Flights arriving at Ninoy Aquino International Airport were carrying young Israelis, some barely 18, others in their late 20s, dragging suitcases with Hebrew stickers, eyes weary from long flights, but filled with an unspoken purpose. They didn't come for beaches or parties. They came carrying questions, grief, and something even deeper, a hunger for peace that they could no longer find at home. You see, 2025 was not an ordinary year. The Middle East was restless again. Many of these students had grown up under the sound of sirens, watching their parents flinch at every headline. They'd seen friends drafted too early, dreams postponed, hopes buried under rubble and rhetoric. By the time they reached university age, they were already tired. Not of Israel, but of the noise. They wanted silence. They wanted to study medicine, psychology, and theology in a place where faith was gentle, not political. And so word began to spread, not through official announcements, but through whispers, blog posts, and late-night conversations. There's a place, one student wrote anonymously in a Hebrew forum, where people smile at strangers, where hospitals feel like sanctuaries, and professors pray before class. At first, no one believed her. But when videos surfaced of Filipino professors teaching Hebrew students how to say mabuhay, something shifted. Curiosity turned into movement. By mid-2025, over 3,000 Israeli students had quietly enrolled in Philippine universities, some in medical schools in Manila, others in theology programs in Cebu, and dozens in social work programs in Davao and Iloilo. No official program linked them. No government press release explained it. But if you asked them why, their answers shared the same heartbeat. We came here to learn about peace. For many, the first shock was how welcomed they felt. In Israel, people debate, one student laughed softly, but in the Philippines, people listen. That small difference felt revolutionary. They described professors who would begin class with a prayer, not to impose faith, but to invite kindness into the room. Cafeteria workers remembered their names. Taxi drivers asked about their families. And slowly, something inside them began to soften. The media tried to explain it in statistics. They called it a new educational migration trend. Economists said it was about cost. Social analysts said it was about English proficiency. But when you looked into the eyes of these students, you realized it wasn't about tuition or language. It was about healing, the kind that can't be measured in currency. There's a small moment that says it all, one that no report captured. A young Israeli medical student named Noam, barely 20, stood outside a chapel in Manila after class. The air was humid, the city noisy, but inside that chapel, a quiet song floated, a hymn sung in Tagalog by students her age. She didn't understand the words, but she started to cry. I think, she said later, This is what peace sounds like. It was in that moment that something bigger began to unfold. A spiritual migration, not just an academic one. They weren't just enrolling in schools. They were stepping into a new way of seeing humanity. And what's most astonishing? The Philippines never advertised it. There were no campaigns, no slogans, no scholarships shouting, "Study here." The invitation was invisible, carried through kindness, faith, and a nation's quiet dignity. The world hadn't noticed yet, but an extraordinary bridge was being built between two unlikely nations, one forged in ancient conflict, the other in quiet compassion. So when people ask, why did thousands of Israeli students choose the Philippines? The answer isn't found in numbers or policy. It's found in moments, in shared prayers before exams, in a Filipino host mother's Sunday lunch, in the sound of laughter during brownouts. It's found in the rediscovery of humanity that can only happen when you step into a country that wears its faith not as power, but as grace. And perhaps that's what makes 2025 unforgettable. The year when the children of Israel found peace, not in Jerusalem, but in the heart of the Philippines. Before the airplanes took off from Manila, before the backpacks were filled with hopes and travel papers, there was something heavier that many of these Israeli students carried: exhaustion. Not just from studying or working, but from years of trying to live normally in a place where normal didn't exist anymore. Some of them grew up in Jerusalem, others near Tel Aviv, Haifa, or Beersheba, places that had seen too many red alerts, too many nights of fear. For a while, they thought that fear was simply a way of life, until it began to swallow the idea of the future itself. It began slowly, first as quiet frustration with the education system that no longer felt alive. Universities that once brimmed with ideas had become places of debate about politics, security, identity. Every conversation was heavy. Every topic somehow circled back to war, religion, or borders. "We wanted to study life," one young woman said, "but everything around us was about survival." Her name was Lior, a second-year psychology student who had seen her cousin drafted before finishing high school. For her, lectures on human behavior felt hollow when the people outside were learning to fear one another. Others had different burdens. Some came from families who'd lost homes in the southern regions. Some had siblings serving at checkpoints. Some had parents still haunted by past conflicts. The word peace had become so political that it no longer meant what it should. "It used to be a prayer," one boy said softly. "Now it's just a slogan." So when universities abroad, in America, Germany, or Japan, offered scholarships, many tried to escape through education. But what they found there was another kind of emptiness: competition, isolation, the cold indifference of systems that measured human worth by productivity. They were chasing hope, and yet every destination felt like another version of loneliness. For one student named Aitan, who left for New York in 2023, that loneliness nearly broke him. He was brilliant, accepted into a top biomedical program. But in that city of lights, he found himself eating alone, studying alone, sleeping alone. The noise was everywhere, but the silence inside was unbearable. "People looked through you," he said, "like everyone was running from something and no one had time to care." When he returned to Israel a year later, he was thinner, quieter, and certain that the Western promise of opportunity had nothing to do with peace of mind. It was around that time when the whispers began, stories shared through online forums, Hebrew language YouTube channels, and small student circles about an unexpected place. They didn't call it a destination. They called it a refuge, a country where professors prayed for their students before exams, where doctors still smiled after 18-hour shifts, where the word faith was not political, but human. The Philippines, an island nation that many had barely studied in school, began appearing in their conversations like a soft echo that refused to fade. At first, it was curiosity. A few searched Philippine University's English medium. What they found surprised them. Modern campuses, internationally accredited programs, and tuition fees that didn't demand a lifetime of debt. But beyond the practical reasons, there was something else. Videos of Filipino teachers laughing with their students, news clips of nurses praying with patients, stories of communities rebuilding after typhoons, yet still singing hymns. It wasn't perfection that drew them in. It was resilience wrapped in grace. A blog post went viral within a small Israeli online group in early 2025. It was written by a young man named Aviv, who had traveled to Cebu for a medical internship. His words spread faster than he could have imagined. In the Philippines, I felt human again. He described how local doctors treated strangers like family, how every conversation began with, "How are you?" and ended with, "Take care." Those simple gestures felt revolutionary to him. In Israel, surrounded by conflict and tension, kindness had become a luxury. In the West, it was treated as weakness. But in the Philippines, it was the language of daily life. That was the moment something shifted collectively, not a decision made by policy or institutions, but by the human spirit itself. More students began reaching out, asking how to apply, how to live there, how to start again. They didn't know they were part of something larger, a quiet exodus toward peace. Some of their parents resisted. "You're leaving everything for what?" they asked. "A country you know nothing about?" But their children didn't answer with arguments. They answered with stillness. Because deep down, they weren't leaving Israel out of rejection. They were leaving to breathe again, to study without the shadow of sirens, to see life from another rhythm. By March 2025, small groups began forming, students helping one another navigate visa forms, connecting with Filipino host families through church networks, planning departures without fanfare. There was no official organization, no media announcement, just determination. Some called it naive, others called it desperate. But when you looked closer, you saw it was neither. It was a quiet rebellion against hopelessness. And somewhere in all of that movement, between airports, embassies, and whispered prayers, a strange feeling began to grow. It wasn't excitement, exactly. It was relief. Like people who had been holding their breath for too long finally inhaling again. One of the last to leave was Eitan, the same student who had once failed to find meaning in New York. When the first flights landed in Manila that humid morning of March 2025, few passengers realized they were part of something that would later be called the silent exodus of hope. The arrivals hall was alive with the usual chaos of the city. The smell of jet fuel, the overlapping voices, the smiles that seemed to stretch wider than the heat itself. Among them stood hundreds of young Israeli students, clutching their passports and acceptance letters, blinking against the golden light of a country they barely knew. Most had expected to feel foreign, out of place, awkward. But something about the Philippines disarmed them before their defenses could rise. Taxi drivers called them anak, a Tagalog word for child, without hesitation. Airport staff greeted them with, "Welcome home," even though they weren't Filipino. It was such a simple phrase, but it struck them deeply, because no one back home, or even in the West, had ever used the word home for them like that. For many, their first days unfolded like a strange dream. Manila's streets were loud, messy, unpredictable, yet filled with warmth. Vendors waved at them, strangers helped them with directions, and local students invited them for lunch as if they'd known them for years. It's as if everyone here is constantly ready to love someone, one Israeli student whispered as she sat in a jeepney for the first time, feeling the wind rush through her hair. They came from a place where every smile was guarded, where kindness was often strategic. But here, kindness was instinctive, and it confused them. At first, they thought it couldn't be real. No society could be this open. There had to be a catch, they said. But as days turned into weeks and no hidden motive appeared, they began to let go. Noam, the medical student who once cried outside the chapel, remembered her first day at the University of Santo Tomas. She expected a formal lecture. Instead, her professor began the session with a prayer, a soft invocation of gratitude, asking for wisdom and patience. Noam didn't understand every word, but she felt it. The air changed. Students bowed their heads in quiet reverence, not out of fear, but out of humility. She had never seen that in her own university, faith and learning intertwined without tension. Across the city, Eitan, the student who once said peace might be something you live, found himself in a theology class in Ateneo. The lesson wasn't about doctrine or dogma, but about empathy. The purpose of theology, his Filipino professor said, is not to prove God right, but to understand why people need hope. The class fell silent. For Eitan, who had grown up hearing sermons about who was right and who was wrong, that one sentence felt like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Outside the classroom, it was the everyday things that transformed them most. Filipino classmates who would share their bayon, homemade lunches wrapped in foil, even when they had little themselves. Security guards who greeted them every morning by name. Church bells that rang through the city not as noise, but as rhythm. The laughter that filled dormitories even during power outages. Many of these students had expected to study in English, but they soon realized they were also learning a new language of the heart, one built on generosity, patience, and unshakable faith. They saw Filipinos who worked long hours, yet still found time to sing in the evenings, to pray before meals, to thank God even for what little they had. I used to think gratitude was something you felt after success, one Israeli student said. But here, they show gratitude even in struggle. That's powerful. One afternoon, in a small medical outreach in Quezon City, a group of Israeli students volunteered to assist local doctors treating children from poor families. The line stretched endlessly. Yet every Filipino nurse smiled. Every parent waited calmly. At the end of the day, exhausted and drenched in sweat, one Israeli student turned to her Filipino colleague and asked, "How do you stay so calm?" The nurse looked up, smiled, and said, "Because we serve, not just work." Those 5 words became a quiet mantra among the students. We serve, not just work. It was the first time they understood what service truly meant, not a duty, but a devotion. Back home, they had seen service through the lens of conflict and obligation. Here, it was about love. It wasn't all easy, of course. The heat, the traffic, the cultural gaps, all of it tested them. But every challenge was met with the same gentle laughter, the same open hands. That's how Filipinos survive, a local priest told them. We find joy before the storm, not after. By the 3rd month, something irreversible had begun. The Israeli students no longer walked as outsiders. They prayed in chapels they couldn't fully understand. They sang in languages they couldn't pronounce. They celebrated fiestas with people they'd only met days before. Slowly, the weight they'd carried, the fear, the guilt, the disillusionment, began to lift. A sense of peace settled in. By mid-2025, the Israeli students who once arrived timidly at Manila's airport were no longer strangers wandering through a foreign land. They had woven themselves into the rhythm of Filipino life, a rhythm that pulsed not with wealth or power, but with faith, laughter, and an unspoken understanding that life's greatest treasures are rarely material. The transformation was not sudden. It was gentle, like sunrise creeping across the horizon after a long night. One Friday afternoon, in a small university dormitory in Quezon City, a storm rolled in. The power went out, as it often did, and the building sank into darkness. A few candles were lit. Somewhere down the hall, a guitar began to play. Israeli and Filipino students gathered in the common area, barefoot, with plates of adobo and rice passed around. No one had planned it. Yet there they were, a circle of young souls singing a mix of Hebrew and Tagalog songs, their voices rising and blending with the rain. It was chaotic, imperfect, but achingly beautiful. One of the Filipinos began singing Bayan Ko, a song of longing and love for one's country. Halfway through, an Israeli student joined in, humming softly, his voice trembling. By the end, everyone was crying, not out of sadness, but because they understood, in that shared silence after the music faded, that they were part of something greater than themselves. For many of them, this was the moment of awakening, when the Philippines stopped being a place on the map and became a mirror of the human spirit. Noam, the medical student, had seen things in the hospital that changed her heart forever. One afternoon, during a free clinic in Tondo, she held the hand of a malnourished boy while a Filipino nurse prayed quietly beside her. The child's mother whispered, "Salamat," even though she had received nothing more than a promise of treatment. "Why do they thank us before we've even helped?" Noam asked later. The nurse smiled gently and said, "Because gratitude heals faster than medicine." That night, Noam wrote in her journal, "I came to study medicine, but here I'm learning how to heal souls." Eitan, who once wandered lost in New York, now found himself attending daily mass in a small chapel in Intramuros. He didn't understand every word of the homily, but he understood the emotion, the unity, the humility, the surrender. He began volunteering at a youth center, teaching Hebrew songs to children who couldn't pronounce his name, but called him Kuya Eitan, Big Brother. Every Friday they'd ask him to tell stories of his homeland. He'd tell them about the desert, about Jerusalem, about a people who had endured for centuries. Then he'd pause, smile, and add, "But I think I've learned more about peace here than anywhere else." The children would laugh, not realizing that he meant every word. Everywhere they went, the same truth followed them. The Filipino way of living, faith despite struggle, joy despite loss, hope despite pain, was not just inspiring, it was contagious. They began to absorb it, reflect it, live it. They prayed before exams, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. They joined in feeding programs, helped rebuild homes after floods, sang karaoke at every celebration, and learned to say "Bahala na," that uniquely Filipino phrase that means "leave it to God." That phrase, once just words, became their anchor. When anxiety returned, when homesickness crept in, they whispered "Bahala na" and felt peace wash over them. For people who had grown up in a world obsessed with control, this surrender was revolutionary. It wasn't about giving up. It was about trusting life again. One unforgettable evening, a joint interfaith gathering was held at the University of the Philippines. Students from different backgrounds, Jewish, Catholic, Muslim, agnostic, filled the hall. On stage, a Filipino priest spoke softly. "Faith is not about who is right. It's about remembering we are all searching for the same light." When the Israeli students were invited to share a reflection, one of them stepped forward. His name was David, a theology student from Haifa. He looked around the hall, eyes glistening, and said, "I was told faith divides. But here, I've seen it heal. You Filipinos, you live faith the way the world has forgotten to." The room fell silent. Then, slowly, applause began to rise. Gentle, heartfelt, endless. By that point, the transformation was complete. These young Israelis no longer saw themselves as visitors. They had become participants in a living lesson of humanity. They started helping new batches of arriving students adjust, teaching them Tagalog phrases, explaining Filipino customs, even hosting Shabbat dinners that blended traditions, challah bread served beside adobo, Hebrew prayers followed by Filipino songs of thanksgiving. It was an image no politician could have scripted. Two cultures, once worlds apart, finding harmony in humility. The most powerful moments were the smallest ones, the laughter shared during jeepney rides, the prayers whispered during typhoons, the way Filipinos crossed themselves before eating, and how the Israelis, at first amused, slowly began to follow. "We never did this before," one said, tracing the sign of the cross awkwardly. "But now it feels right." And so, what began as a search for education became a pilgrimage of the heart. These students who had once sought knowledge discovered something far more valuable: compassion. In the Philippines, they found not just teachers, but by the end of 2025, the story that began as a quiet migration had turned into something the world could no longer ignore. News outlets in Tel Aviv, London, and New York began reporting on the phenomenon. Thousands of Israeli students who had chosen to study and stay in the Philippines. What began as curiosity had become a movement of hearts. And yet, if you asked the students themselves, they would tell you it wasn't about education or opportunity or even escape. It was about rediscovering the meaning of life in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. Many of them were preparing to return home after graduation, but few were the same people who had arrived months before. They spoke differently now, softer, slower, more deliberate. They smiled more easily, prayed more often, and no longer saw faith as weakness, but as strength. "The Philippines didn't just teach us," one of them said, "it healed us." Noam, who had come to study medicine, now spent her weekends volunteering in public hospitals, teaching local interns emergency techniques she'd learned in Israel. But she insisted she was the one who had learned the most. "In Manila, I met doctors who work 18 hours a day and still say, 'Thank God we helped one more child.' I used to think saving lives was science," she said in an interview, "but here I learned it's also love." Eitan, once the lost student from New York, now planned to open an intercultural study center in Tel Aviv, dedicated to Filipino values, faith, compassion, and service. He said it wasn't a cultural project, it was a spiritual one. "We need this back home," he said quietly. "We need to remember how to listen, how to forgive, how to live with joy even when the world burns around us." And they weren't alone. Dozens of others shared similar stories, stories of hearts changed by the warmth of Filipino families who had opened their doors to strangers. Host mothers who cooked extra rice for homesick students, local classmates who invited them to Christmas Eve masses or Ramadan dinners. Communities that didn't care where you came from, as long as you came with respect. For people raised in a world of divisions, this was radical. It wasn't long before these students began writing letters, not to governments or institutions, but to each other, to their families, to their professors back home. They wrote about jeepneys and fiestas, about the smell of rain on Manila streets, about nights filled with laughter, even when the lights went out. "I thought I came to the Philippines to study," one letter read, "but what I really came for was to remember." Some returned home carrying that memory like a flame they refused to let die. Others stayed, choosing to build their lives in the country that had adopted them without conditions. One Israeli theology student married a Filipina nurse he met during a medical mission in Iloilo. They built a small foundation that sent used medical books to remote schools in Mindanao. "We owe this country more than we can ever repay," he said. "But maybe that's the point. You're not supposed to repay kindness. You're supposed to pass it on." By December of that year, the first interfaith conference between Filipino and Israeli educators was held in Cebu. It was small, almost unnoticeable by global media, but for those who attended, it was history. On stage, Eitan spoke again, his voice steady, his Hebrew accent softening as he addressed the audience. "In the world today," he said, "we've mastered technology but forgotten humanity. The Philippines reminded us that peace is not a treaty, it's a way of living. You taught us that joy is not the absence of suffering, but the courage to love despite it." The room fell silent. A Filipino nun seated near the front wiped her eyes. And then, from the back of the hall, a voice began to sing softly. It was a familiar melody, first in Tagalog, then in Hebrew. The students joined in, one by one, until the entire room was filled with two languages, two faiths, two worlds singing the same song. It wasn't perfect harmony, but it was real, and perhaps that made it more beautiful. When the music faded, the applause was quiet but endless. Many later said that moment was when they truly understood what unity felt like, not something forced or political, but something human, born of shared pain and shared hope. Months later, when journalists asked why so many Israelis had chosen the Philippines, one young woman simply answered, "Because in the Philippines, I saw what I had been praying for all my life." That line spread across social media, shared millions of times, becoming a symbol of something much larger than migration. It became a testament to what happens when two nations meet not through power, but through compassion. For the Philippines, this wave of students became both a gift and a reminder that the world is watching, and that the heart of this nation, its faith, resilience, and hospitality, is something sacred. For Israel, it became a lesson that peace might not come from diplomacy alone, but from the quiet grace of ordinary people who choose kindness every day. And for everyone who heard their story, it was proof that in a divided world, bridges can still be built, not through speeches or politics, but through love that asks for nothing in return. As the year closed, Eitan stood on the shores of Manila Bay, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and crimson. Around him, friends, Filipino and Israeli, laughed, took pictures, and sang softly to the waves. The light shimmered on the water like scattered blessings. He whispered a prayer, half in Hebrew, half in Tagalog. "Salamat sa kapayapaan. Toda al-ha-shalom." Thank you for the peace. And maybe that was the answer the world had been searching for all along. That peace doesn't belong to nations. It belongs to hearts willing to open, to forgive,